Jeremy Browne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have heard it said of me that I am the only minister in history to have been sacked from a government for being too supportive of the government. And while the decision to determine my future may or may not have been wise, and others can judge that, I do remain unequivocally enthusiastic about this government and about the budget speech made by the Chancellor today. And it's that I want to speak about in what will be my final speech as a Member of Parliament. The reason I am an enthusiast for this government and its record over the last 5 years is because I think we came to office in 2010 in remarkably difficult circumstances. Our country was in a catastrophic position. At our worst point, we were borrowing, our country's government, £420 million every single day. And it is straightforwardly delusional of Labour members of Parliament to think that if only we borrowed even more, we wouldn't have a problem of a deficit today. We saved the country. The Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrat Party, working together in the national interest, pulled our country back from the brink when our deficit was more than 10% of GDP. And far from going too far and too fast, as has been charged by the Shadow Chancellor and others, I think if I am critical at all, we have done the minimum of what was required rather than overextended ourselves, and we can do even more in the future. But it is a good record. Interest rates are extremely low. We could easily have had a position where houses were being repossessed right across the country. Inflation is extremely low. Unemployment has fallen dramatically, including youth unemployment during this Parliament. And of course, the deficit is falling as well. And in my view, if this coalition government put itself forward for election, and it won't, but if it were on the ballot paper on the 7th of May, it would win emphatically, and it would deserve to win, because it has an impressive record of taking a country from ruin to relative prosperity with the prospect of further progress. The best coalitions are those that are more than the sum of their parts. The worst coalitions are those that operate at the level of the lowest common denominator. And I don't think this government has always functioned as effectively as it might have done, and that is true of all governments. But more often than not, it has had the characteristics of the best coalitions rather than the worst coalitions, and the United Kingdom has benefited from that. I think it has also actually been of benefit that we have had two parties in government, because this has been a hugely difficult process, wrestling with this massive deficit and a lot of the other structural problems that our country faces. But to have two parties coming together, representing about 60% of the votes cast at the last general election, gave a wider mandate for this Chancellor and this government. And I think, if I'm being honest about our coalition partners, there would have been greater anxiety about the Conservatives adopting a programme of reducing state spending had it not been done in partnership with the Liberal Democrats. I remember also, while I am on a short passage being mildly critical of our coalition partners, standing on the other side of the House. Seems hard to believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, that Liberal Democrats once sat on that side of the House, but it is true. And I remember hearing speeches from the now Chancellor promising that the Conservatives would match Labour's spending commitments, even when we were running a deficit and the economy was growing. So I'm very pleased that this government has showed a sober awareness of the predicament that we find ourselves in, and that my party has contributed some of the biggest and most enduring policies, economic policies, of this government, not least, of course, the dramatic rise in the point at where people start paying income tax, and the Chancellor, I'm pleased to say, announced further increases in that threshold today. There is still a long way to go. A lot of people in Parliament, in the media and elsewhere talk as if this huge task is almost over. We are still borrowing £10 million an hour, the British government, even today, Our debt interest is about £1 billion a week. Every week, the taxes of our constituents, £1 billion, £1,000 million, goes not on schools or hospitals or the police, but goes on paying the legacy of overspending in the past, and that figure will rise because we still have a debt which is increasing today. But huge progress has been made. Where now? Where do we go next, Madam Deputy Speaker? We have huge strengths as a country. Our top-level education is among the best in the world, second, I would say, only to the United States of America. Our labour markets are flexible. We attract inward investment. We are a country with a genuine global disposition, and we are admired for our innovation and creativity. Britain can be a success. We have reasons to be highly optimistic, but we will only be successful if we address some of our serious weaknesses. And we do have serious weaknesses as a country. Our overall education performance, not at the elite level, but at the general level, is still not sufficiently good for us to be globally competitive. Our infrastructure, particularly our transport infrastructure, but also our energy generating infrastructure, needs to improve. Our welfare costs and welfare dependency are a problem for our country. It was Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, Madam Deputy Speaker, who said, and I do this from memory without the exact numbers in front of me, that Europe has 7% of the world's population, 23%, I think it was, of the world's economy, but 50% of the world's welfare spending. That is a very precarious position, and of course the 7% is falling, the 23% is falling, the 50% is not falling, or at least not nearly as quickly as the other two numbers are falling. And of course we still have a very high level of government debt in this country and a high deficit. But this government, whether it is educational shortfalls, excessive welfare costs and dependency, infrastructure, debt, has worked to systematically address the weaknesses which will otherwise hold our country back. So we have those enduring strengths, but we have had in the last 5 years a government with the wherewithal, with the talent and the vision to address our weaknesses as well. And I want us to have a sense of purpose in politics. I want us to think about how we can become the biggest economy in Europe within a generation, as the Chancellor talked about in his budget speech. I want us to be able to think about how we as a country with less than 1% of the world's population can be relevant in an era of much more intense global competition, how we can be world leaders in innovation and skills and job creation. I think all of these are possible. They are prizes within our grasp, but we have to have the level of optimism and vision necessary to realise those outcomes. And I finish, Madam Deputy Speaker, by saying what a privilege it has been for me to represent Taunton Deane in Somerset, Taunton for 5 years, the Taunton constituency, and then more latterly Taunton Deane, and to have served 10 years in the House of Commons, and to have supported what I think is a radical and important government in the history of our country. And I want to make my final comment on this about politics generally and about the role of members of Parliament. I was listening to the Today programme last week, and a person was being interviewed he was either French or I think he might have been Swiss French speaker, but he was seeking to be the first person ever to fly around the world in an entirely solar-panelled plane. And it's an extraordinary plane because it has a wingspan like a 747 but weighs about the same as a family car. So it sounds absolutely terrifying undertaking. And the interviewer said to him that he didn't doubt his courage and his sense of adventure, but what possible application would this feat of adventure have that Boeing and Airbus and the airliners weren't interested in the technology? They didn't think it would have any great future use. And the interviewee, I imagine it was on the radio, it sounded like he was shrugging his shoulders in the way that only French-speaking people can do. And he said, that is to be expected. He said, the inventors of the candlestick did not invent the light bulb. And it's rather sort of Eric Cantona-esque moment. But he was making, I think, an important point, which is that we can't, in our politics, always be risk-averse, always be in the business of preserving the past rather than trying to seize the opportunities of the future. And if we allow politics, in all parts of this House, in all parties, to be about how we can frustrate and regulate and tax light bulb inventors and how we can subsidise and prop up candlestick manufacturers, we will be in a position where the events of the world in a globalised economy with very rapid technological change, demographic change and economic change will leave this House of Commons behind, and trust in politics will subside further. And that, in my view, would be hugely regrettable. We have made enormous progress, in my view, under this government, in this Parliament. But whichever government is in office after the general election, I would urge the people in this Parliament and the leader of that government to be visionary and ambitious for our country, because I think we can have a great future ahead.